Welcome to Round Hill Radio, the podcast from Round Hill Community Church. Through our conversations, we discover the holy and the ordinary, find moments of grace and peace, and redefine what we're talking about when we talk about faith. Welcome to Round Hill Radio. I'm Leslie.
I'm Ed.
And I'm Dan.
Hey, Dan. Welcome to the party today.
Thank you.
So Dan was so willing to join us as we are talking about the book Jesus and the Disinherited by Howard Thurman. So a couple things before we get started. One, this is a book I wish I had read 20 years ago. It clarified so many things for me that I kind of had on the outskirts of experience or understanding or hearing, and really just shone so much light in so many corners of my understanding. So firstly, I'm just so glad we're doing this. If you, dear listeners and watchers, have not had a chance to read this book, I cannot recommend it highly enough. Even the audiobook is really, really well read. So if you're an audio file, then I encourage you to do it that way if that's your jam. It's worth saying that any conversation that we're having here, if you haven't read the book yet, it's going to kind of be watered down. We obviously all bring our own context, our own personal histories to this. So I would encourage you, if you haven't listened or read the book yet, to go do that first and then join us in conversation. Because I really think it's important to approach the book through your own lens, and then be part of this conversation. I think it's, we're all in our own bubbles, in our own spheres. And so I think it's helpful to find where you are and then find where we are. And then hopefully this is only the beginning of a much bigger conversation that we're going to continue here on Round Hill Radio. So we're so grateful for you taking the time, spending this time with us. So we're going to launch in. So Ed has generously offered to give us some background on this, and go forth.
Well, I'll put out a few sort of large brushstrokes about Howard Thurman's life. And I will say that I'd never heard of Howard Thurman until I went to seminary. So when I attended seminary, Union Theological Seminary, there was a very strong Black Studies program. And I learned very quickly that Howard Thurman was a very, very important figure in the African-American church movement throughout the early part of the 20th century. He was born in 1899. And he died in 1981. And so he had a very close relationship with, I believe it's his maternal grandmother. And he mentions her in the book. She comes in a very important way, actually. She gave him some counsel that turned out to be very important in his life. So she was actually a slave, lived as a slave, and took all of that memory of that horrifying time with her, obviously, throughout her entire life, and shared a lot of that with Howard Thurman. So you can imagine how that affected him. He grew up in Florida, and I think he attended one of what, at that time, there were only 3 high schools in the entire state of Florida that served African-American students. And he attended one of them. And he then went on to Morehouse College. He was a classmate of Martin Luther King Jr.'s father, who eventually became known as Daddy King. And he then went on to seminary. It seems like wherever Howard Thurman went to school, he was a valedictorian. He just finished number 1 wherever he was. So
we love overachievers here, don't we?
A little overachiever, yeah, but a great overachiever, right? And he just was a very great student, a great learner. And I think he carried that with him through his whole life. Throughout his adult life, he was always associated in some way with an institution of higher education. Mm-hmm. And he often served as either, a dean of the chapel or a professor of philosophy or religion. So there were so many students who benefited from their contact with him. But principally, it was Martin Luther King Jr. who saw him as one of his great mentors. And Dr. King always carried a copy of Jesus and the Disinherited with him wherever he went. So this book was written in 1949. And it's interesting to think that that book was written in 49 and the Montgomery bus boycott was in 1955. So I just think of Martin Luther King Jr. reading that book And then just, probably as soon as it came out, because he was a close family friend. And then just 6 years later, Dr. King finds himself not in a position that he actually sought, but, as the kind of the spiritual head of the Montgomery bus boycott.
Absolutely.
So those were some very broad brushstrokes. And he's a person who continues to exert a lot of influence. And I think I'll just say that the reason we came across him is that I've been doing some work through my denomination, the United Church of Christ, on racial justice. And we've been working with two men who are part of an organization called Racial Resilience. And they use this book in all of their work. And they do a lot of work with institutions of higher education and otherwise. And so that's how we got started. So then we brought it into our little circle here.
Yeah, and I'm so glad we did. It's interesting I was raised in Atlanta, Georgia. Howard Thurman was a name I've known often in the same sentence as Martin Luther King Jr. Obviously, there's such a complex history in that city. And unsurprisingly, I was raised in a fairly gentrified, very, very gentrified part of the city. And as I got a little bit older and was able to explore more and was exposed to more of the more diverse and wonderful parts of the city that way, it's just, I feel like I only saw the tip of an iceberg of a culture that I never really fully understand. And so it's really interesting to hear his voice, and it connects to some part of my childhood memory and childhood experience of sort of hearing these names of these amazing figures, and what my childhood and my childlike understanding was. And then as now my adult understanding has evolved, it's so interesting, and nice to sort of connect the dots a little bit better and a little bit clearer and start to color in where once there was just line art. It's been really fascinating. I'm so glad we're doing this. Enough self-congratulation. So let's dive in. I was so connected with the idea. I found this story that he was saying about his grandmother, about how she wouldn't read any of the scripture of Paul. Right. Which is in the first chapter, which is titled, I believe, Jesus and Interpretation. We're going to kind of take this chapter by chapter as a convenient way to organize our thoughts. And I thought that was so interesting, because the scripture of Paul was used in such a negative way during slave times. That was she had such a strong visceral reaction against it, but she was so willing to read other, to engage with the Bible still, I think was such a testament to her faith.
Yeah. It's really, you think about her, she was forced to listen to sermons from white preachers when she served as a slave. And that text was almost always, slaves, be obedient to your masters. A text that's attributed to St. Paul. And it's interesting to see Howard Thurman wrestling with that text, because he tries to put it in a larger context. And in a sense, he's not letting Paul off, but he is saying, so you have to understand some things about Paul in order to understand why he makes that comment. He's a citizen. He sees himself as a citizen of the Roman Empire. And, he's connected with all of the governmental infrastructure that goes along with this. So he's trying hard to understand why Paul would say something like that, but nevertheless, his grandmother basically boycotted that entire section of the New Testament, and that didn't change.
Except for 1 Corinthians 13.
That's right. Thank you. Yeah, that's right. That was the exception, the great hymn of love. Yeah.
I thought that, which I thought was so perfect. I was like, she sound like a force, yes, to be sure.
So I'd love to, I was thinking about this conversation, and it's just so helpful for me. And I was going back to my early memories of faith formation. And I gotta be honest, I'll just throw this out there too. I was not familiar with Howard Thurman or any of African-American theologians, and even in seminary. And the irony is not lost there on me. And in fact, I went to seminary with a very large African-American population. but yet they were not reading the theologians or the works of the pastors of African Americans. And so it took me a long time to be in travels. And in fact, it was really my time at the American Church in Paris that I became more aware and exposed to like liberation theology and even Martin Luther King Jr., who preached at the American Church in Paris. Of course, I knew of him, but probably had not read many of his works until I found myself preaching from that same pulpit he preached and saying and believing that there's so much I can learn. And so it's been a really interesting journey for me, and I have a lot to learn from Thurman and from his grandmother and how people approach the text and even Paul. And I was just thinking about this just actually yesterday because it's Palm Sunday and we're entering into Holy Week. And so, the expectations of the people when Jesus comes in is they're expecting this person of power, of great influence, of military might. And they're rallying around him because they think that he is going to reinstate Israel and overthrow Rome and take the seat, get power. Well, that wasn't why he came. And we, of course, know the story. And he, in fact, rode in on a donkey, very symbolic of this self-emptying love. And yet I find it so interesting that throughout, at least almost a 2,000 year history of the Christian church, but certainly from, 300 to 400 AD, the church, when they've gained power, when they've wanted power, they've rallied around Jesus. But yet the Jesus of Scripture, and Howard Thurman points us out in the first chapter, was not in a position of power. Jesus was a poor Jew, and living, as an sort of living as a minority in this power structure of Rome. And so you can understand how Thurman and anyone who feels disenfranchised, disinherited, maybe as opposed to Paul, who actually had rights and was a citizen and actually was very different than Jesus positionally, how Christ in the person of Jesus really resonates with the outcast and the marginalized and those who feel powerless. But yet the aspects of the Christian church or Christendom has rallied around Christ as this power figure. And I just find that very, there's a great irony and sort of sadness in that. And so it's something that I'm still wrestling with as well, because of the position that I was born into. And so this book, and even just this first chapter, helping to really understand and interpret the world of Jesus, how Jesus saw the world, how Jesus responded to those in power, those without power. He did not have power. He did not have, influence or rights, very similar to, as opposed to Paul, is very helpful to help just frame that context. And so I'm glad that we're reading this book and delving into this. And I know, Leslie, you said this is just the tip of the iceberg. We're scratching the surface, but I think these conversations are really, really relevant, clearly, and really important for us as people of faith. Absolutely.
The thing the way he framed Paul was so interesting to me because Paul was a person who had government protection. He could go to the government if there was an issue. That was something Jesus did not have. But then there's also this other side of Paul, framed in this book at least, is that Paul felt like an outsider, that he was not a direct disciple of Jesus. He was an apostle, but he wasn't a direct disciple. And that the other disciples would go to him and be like, well, you weren't there. You don't know. And this sort of perceived or actual feeling of slight on Paul's side, I think is something that we can, without great effort, draw some connections to in modern day, of this idea of just like, there's two sides to every story, of course, but that it's, that finding identity of Jesus and this idea of Jesus of being peace and love and the meek and the humble is such a core tenet of the faith. And then like you said, to take it and, in my opinion, twist it, I think if you take 3 seconds and start looking at it, you're like, what is actually happening here? Like, how has it happened for millennia that that's something that's been done over and over and over again?
Right.
It kind of boggles the mind a little bit, or a lot of it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think these are great questions to ask. I think one of the things I like most about this little book is that he raises such basic questions. He asks at the very beginning, so how is it that a religion built around essentially a Mediterranean Jewish peasant becomes the religion of the dominant, right? And the religion becomes used, as he points out, by slaveholders to reinforce a form of domination, which actually Jesus came to overthrow. I mean, it's one of the most bizarre kinds of manipulations that you can imagine. And so by starting off with that basic question, though, he does, and I think this is what you're both suggesting, it does kind of push the needle back in our direction. So what has become of our relationship with this Mediterranean Jewish peasant, right? And who doesn't have access to the corridors of power. In fact, doesn't even want it in one sense, because he's building a different kind of movement. He's building a whole different infrastructure that's based on giving away power. And this is the thing that really fascinates Thurman. He said, here is a person who is completely for the disenfranchised. Mm-hmm. This is the essence of his mission. And when we lose that, we lose everything about Jesus.
Absolutely. And I think that because he was disenfranchised himself, there's a quote here, if you'll allow me. It says, he was not protected by the normal guarantees of citizenship, that quiet sense of security which comes from knowing that you belong, and the general climate of confidence which it inspires. And I think that, I think you called it a little book, and it is short and mighty.
Yes.
In its density. I think I ran out of highlighter ink in my highlighter because every sentence packs such a punch of just value and truth sometimes, and hard truth some other times. And then I think on the next page, to me, I put a bracket and I wrote thesis, where he says, the striking similarity between the social position of Jesus in Palestine and the vast majority of African Americans is obvious to anyone who tarries long over the facts.
Yes.
And I would say tarries briefly over the facts. I think it's even more so today, as we are seeing really important conversations about race happening in our nation. It is bringing information to the forefront and conversations to the forefront that, in my opinion, have been conversations that have been needing to happen, and things that have been happening for decades and generations. And I think that this is so helpful in understanding some of the sticking points, I feel like, especially, in my own world, it's how can I talk to people? How can I communicate how I'm feeling about these things and find compassion? Ed and I actually yesterday had a conversation about understanding versus compassion, and that understanding maybe isn't necessary for compassion. And actually later in the book, I put a big star next to a sentence where Howard Thurman wrote about unsympathetic underndstanding. And understanding and compassion are not the same thing. So we'll get to that later. I'm excited. Yeah. I'm getting ahead of myself.
It's a teaser. It's on the horizon.
Get excited. It'll probably be in the next episode.
Yeah.
So then we lead into the sort of like the introduction of the book, that first chapter. And then we lead into an entire chapter about fear. Right. Which when I first dove into this book, I would not have guessed that was how this book was organized.
Right. How it's constructed. So I have a question for both of you. So I think you've answered it in part, Leslie, which is, was it surprising when you open up this book? First chapter, it's Jesus in interpretation. We say, okay, that seems to make sense. And then the title of the next chapter is fear. Mm-hmm. So what do you make of that? Why does he structure the book that way?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know why he did, but I have a guess, and at least it's helpful for me, because that chapter, I wasn't expecting that either. But then I thought about that, and for me to just begin to empathize or understand the plight of the disinherited is to try to get into the mindset and their culture and everything about a disinherited people group, and fear. I mean, this is a thing that's front and center. It's just clearly fear that drives away relationships, that causes people to act out, that causes rifts, that causes all of these things. It's coming from a place of fear because of the way people have been treated. And like for me growing up, I might be afraid of certain, falling down and hurting myself, but I've never experienced this overwhelming sense of fear, especially in a relationship with other people. It's not been my story. That is the story. That is the plight for so many people throughout history. And, it was really hard honestly, for me, and challenging to read that chapter because I was starting to understand a bit more of the plight and what goes on in people's minds and hearts and how that can impact everything. Mm-hmm. Everything is clouded by this weight of fear because of oppression, because of inequity, because of all everything that they've experienced systemically and systematically. And so I almost feel like it's hard to begin or to look past the resolution or to get to the resolution without understanding fear first. And it's a hard way to jump into it, but a really important way.
Yeah. And I feel like our tendency is to want to jump to the last chapter, which is love. You're like, let's go there. That one's nicer. That one's easier. But first you have to get through the 3 chapters of fear, deception, and hate, which he calls the 3 hounds of hell, which I think is such a great, wonderful description. I think too, that you could almost, these 3 chapters, you could almost have the rest of the title of them be and power or versus power, fear and power, deception and power, hate and power. This idea that these are byproducts, these are coping mechanisms, these are direct results of inequity, I think is so interesting and absolutely challenging of, even that, and fear. And then he also dives into the reaction of fear. So that there is fear on the part of the disinherited and disenfranchised. Then there's also this like reactive fear in the groups of those in power, of fear of the other, and this like fear of uprising. He uses David and Goliath as an example, which I thought was so interesting. It just is sort of like ping pong thing. Once fear is in the conversation, it becomes all encompassing. Wow. And I think that's the word, sort of what we see in all 3 of those, in fear, in deception, and in hate, that once there's that drop of it, it just amplifies and amplifies and amplifies in a group or between groups.
And if he only had those 3 chapters, I think it paints a stark picture of reality. And it's really depressing because you start to understand both sides. Again, I think he does a brilliant job doing that. You understand about the fear, and Leslie made a great point. And then there's the fear of those who are in power. They fear losing their power. They fear an uprising. They fear violence. They fear, and so they're not going to give an inch. They're not going to do anything to help the disenfranchised and disinherited because they fear what will happen. And you start to understand, and I'm not saying you condone, but you understand both sides and why we're at this like standstill and why we've been at this standstill for centuries. And you think, oh, there's no hope. I mean, we see it for what it is and we see how it's become what it is. So again, I'm glad that it's not just the hounds of hell, those 3 chapters, because there is hope. And he gets to that. But again, I think to understand that it's not just this easy cliche, like, oh, just love everybody. And no, it would take serious work and effort on both sides to come to a place of reconciliation. And the only way to really appreciate the seriousness of the work that's needed is to go through these 3 chapters, to go through, the fear and the deception and the hatred, and to understand that. So it's almost like going through, again, thinking about Holy Week right now, because that's front and center. It's like going through the cross in order to get to Easter. Mm-hmm. Easter doesn't mean as much, if anything, if you don't go through the cross. But to get through that, to go through the agony and the pain and the despair and the death of that Friday and that Saturday is really hard, painful, but you have to go through that. And I feel like he's bringing us through that just in this book. And again, a short book, but a mighty book. And he's bringing us through in just 3 chapters, the plight and the struggle on both sides. So it's a challenge, but it's one that it's really important for us to understand and to enter into.
Yeah, I was struck back in the first chapter. So one question I always ask when I'm reading a book like this is, who's it for? Who's the audience? Mm. And, part of me, as I was reading through the first chapter, thought, well, in a sense, this is for everyone. And he says something about Jesus that I think sort of makes for that foundation that the audience is very large. He says, again and again, Jesus came back to the inner life of the individual. With increasing insight and startling accuracy, he placed his finger on the inward center as the crucial arena where the issues would determine the destiny of his people, which is interesting because obviously Jesus is living with and working with people who are materially impoverished. You can just imagine, the high rate of, infant death. I mean, people dying of starvation, overtaxed, overworked. However, as he points out, it's really liberation has to start with this interior life. So after he has that first chapter, he automatically brings us inside the mind of the disinherited person. So you get 3 chapters, right? And these are the 3 dominant themes that he sees. And it occurred to me as I was reading through this. Now I've read this book years ago, but as I reread it for our conversation, I feel like I'm overhearing a conversation that he's having with someone else, that it's not really addressed to me directly. It's not addressed to me as a white male directly, but it's important for me to overhear this conversation and to understand where he's really addressing these comments. He's really speaking to people who have their backs against the wall, and he constantly repeats that. We get to be part of the conversation, but it's almost as if now we are asked to stand off to the side and, not be the center part of the conversation. And I think, Leslie, you mentioned something earlier, we want to get to that last chapter. When's love going to come into this? What I've been learning from people who are organizing workshops on racial justice these days, that people, especially white people, want to say, okay, what are we going to do? What's the action we're going to take? And over again, I'm hearing, you're not ready to take action. You haven't understood the inner life of the person yet, who's been so afflicted and impacted by racism. So first of all, just step back and listen and learn. And I think that's why more and more people are starting to read Howard Thurman's little book here.
That makes me think of a quote I heard yesterday that has completely blown my mind and transformed my day, which is that I will learn nothing today from the words that I speak. I will only learn from listening. Because anything we say is something we already know. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the only thing we can learn, the only way we can learn is through listening. And so that's just blown my mind. As a person who is often, my report card as a kid was like, she talks too much.
No, I would never have guessed that.
Thanks, guys.
Which is why you make a great podcast host and facilitator.
See, it was meant to be. But the idea of listening really is an intentional listening, right? Not listening is not talking. listening is being part of a conversation without constantly talking. And I think that's such an interesting thing. I feel like we should take an opportunity to clarify some language real quick. In the preface of the edition I had, there was a foreword, and I've heard you guys have both said this term, liberation theology. For me and for our listeners, can we define that a little bit? Because I'm not really clear on what that actually is.
Yeah, good question. Dan, how did you talked about discovering this in some ways after you attended seminary and part of your work at the American Church in Paris. What did liberation theology come to mean for you?
Yeah, well, I mean, in some ways I would actually look at Howard Thurman as well. I mean, there's, Oscar Romero and some, other theologians that, to my understanding, have all been part of an ethnic minority group. And so the way that they have approached the scriptures and the way that they have approached theology, their understanding of God and God's interaction in the world has come from that place, which is traditionally, historically, radically different than those who have written and approached theology from a place of power. And so very often to look at the story of the Exodus and kind of that's the central theme of a lot of, their theological lens, and, freedom of slavery and captivity and oppression and the inbreaking of justice that continues in the reign of Jesus. And so it's a lens, it's one interpretation. But that I think historically too, I know in Latin America, the liberation theologians really came to prominence and had great impact upon the churches and movements in places like Latin America and other places as well. But then again, for maybe for some of those reasons, I mean, a kid growing up in New Hampshire, I really had never heard of that. And also, therefore, never, as we all do, we're products of our culture and our own cultural lens. So I had approached the Bible only from one lens, only from one theological perspective. And so as I began to read some liberation theologians and their works, for me, it opened my eyes in a wonderful way to the boldness and the beauty of the texts that can speak with and for all people. And, I think that's one of the things that most seminaries will try to do is provide different types of theological ways of looking at the text. So then you get a richer, more brilliant mosaic, if you will, of that. And this is one really important critical piece.
Maybe just one follow-up comment on that he mentions in his opening chapter, it has long been a matter of serious moment that for decades we have studied the various peoples of the world and those who live as our neighbors as objects of missionary endeavor and enterprise without being at all willing to treat them either as brothers or as sisters or as human beings. And I think liberation theology, as Dan's pointing out, is part of it is it does ask the question, what are the people hearing, right? It's not what are we bringing to a particular group, but what is their relationship with God and what are they thinking about that? How do they read the gospel? What hope do they see in it? So as opposed to the traditional missionary impulse, which goes from a position of power to a position of weakness and says, we're here to convert you and save your soul. This is more about God wants to liberate you from economic injustice, racial injustice, gender injustice. And that's the great thrust of liberation theology, and to really open up that voice, which so often goes unheard, as Thurman points out.
Yeah. And it's about the here and now, and I think with the missionaries, and I'm glad, Ed, you mentioned that, this kind of colonial spirit of, yes, we are here to save you, to protect you, to help you. And if they would ever use the word liberate, it would only be to liberate you for eternal salvation, So with very little, historically, very little concern for the here and now and the plight, the economic plight, poverty, illness. They said, well, if we just save your souls, then it doesn't matter what happens to you in this world. It doesn't really matter. It's almost irrelevant because you're good for after you die. And in fact, the sooner you die, probably the better, because you're going to a better place. I mean, this is really the mentality, and this is what people have heard. So liberation theology says, no, Jesus' dream, it was to bring the kingdom of God on earth as it is in heaven. And if heaven's going to be a place of no more warfare, no more bloodshed, no more tears, no more poverty, no more pain, illness, we should be working towards that now for all people. And anytime you have people who are struggling in any way, that they need to be liberated from that. Jesus fed people real food. He healed people of real diseases and illnesses first. And sometimes he never preached afterwards. He just healed them because that was his mission, to restore dignity and health and wholeness to people while they were alive on earth. And that's in sort of the thrust of liberation theology. And it can be challenging for people in power who have a different otherworldly mindset, I'll say.
That's so helpful. Thank you both for that. I think that helps. That also just ties into what we were just talking about, because it feels like in the traditional mode, I suppose, that's very much speaking without listening.
Right.
It ties into that, to what we were just saying precisely. So then chapter 3, deception. Which if you had me guess what the 3 chapters were, I would never have guessed deception. I thought it was interesting. He starts with a very, to me, funny example of a student trying to distract their teacher from a thing they don't want to do, which is something I see almost every day in piano lessons. I have one very sweet student who tries to get me to talk about my dog because she knows I'll go on and on for about 10 minutes straight. I've caught on finally. But, we start from sort of something as innocuous and humorous as that to obviously some much more dramatic and life-saving sometimes deceptions over the period. And then this idea that he had this concept of deception changing who you are, that this fundamental, that repetitive habitual deception fundamentally changes you as a person.
Yes.
I think he said something, I've lost the quote, but it's basically that you don't know where the lies start and the lies end when it's something that has been so much a part of your life. And then go ahead. Sorry.
Well, just a quick thought, Leslie, just following what you're saying, you create, as a disenfranchised person, you create a persona because it's designed to help you survive. And he says this so bluntly. He says, on the subsistence level, values are interpreted in terms of their bearing upon the one major concern of all activity, not being killed. I mean, to think about what it means, to wake up in the morning and understand clearly that your objective that day is not to be killed. Not to be killed, he says, becomes the great end, and morality takes its meaning from that center. And I love the way that when he's talking about deception, he says a profound piece of surgery has to take place in the very psyche of the disinherited before the great claim of the religion of Jesus can be presented. So he's saying you can't even introduce this Jesus and interpretation until you first have kind of opened up the space. The great stretches of barren places in the soul must be revitalized, brought to life before they can be challenged. I mean, he writes with such sensitivity, right? He's kind of like a surgeon of the soul. And he sees this way in which the psyche has become so twisted and shaped by virtue of the fear of being killed that, so how do you help a person to discover their real self, their true self? I think he calls it in other writings, the genuine self. When all of those layers, right, have accumulated over time. So in the end, we say, I don't really know who I am anymore. I mean, that's a very traumatic thing to come to in one life.
Absolutely. Yeah. The deception as a coping mechanism. There's so many easily thought of groups in the world that we've experienced do that, whether it's by race or by gender or what have you, that it's that you become inherently, I always picture sort of like you have a space you're supposed to fill and you contort to try to fill it and you no longer look like you anymore.
Right. Yeah. Great image.
I don't want to jump ahead a little bit in the chapter, but I'm struck by this letter he had from Mahatma Gandhi later in the chapter. So he's gone through deception. We could go back, of course, but he says, "Speak the truth without fear and without exception, and see everyone whose work is related to your purpose. You are in God's work, so you need not fear man's scorn. If they listen to your requests and grant them, you will be satisfied. If they reject them, then you must make their rejection your strength." And I find that such a statement of courage. And then he goes on to basically say, if you're by yourself, that's almost impossible. But if you have like-minded people with you all speaking the truth, then you're going to be okay. And it ties in so much with so many things we've talked about on this podcast. We talked about in conversations about climate change. How does one person reverse this? Well, stop being one person. Right.
Yeah.
Right. Which is an oversimplification, of course, especially in this situation. But I think that that quote from Gandhi just strikes me as such a bold, empowering thing, but also a challenge. And I can't imagine someone hearing this who finds himself in that situation being like, well, that easier said than done, Gandhi. Yeah. Is kind of what I pictured the reader of that letter to say.
Yeah. And those words, I appreciate it, is the sense of sincerity and authenticity, but challenge as well, because, and Thurman's able to do that because he knows that plight. I mean, he's speaking from within and not giving excuses for disinherited people to react or act a certain way, to as Leslie, the analogy that you use, to kind of become something different. He's saying, no, you were meant to become much more. And that's so important to reclaim who you are and to bring like-minded people around you, because there's strength in numbers. And collectively, you help to remember your humanity. And then you see others in their full humanity as well. And I can imagine, that this sentiment and this both sort of challenge and encouragement was echoing in the voice of the civil rights leaders, Martin Luther King Jr. and John Lewis and others, because they found solidarity with one another and they spoke the truth, and they stood up or sat down for what they believed to be right. And they did that together. They found power and strength from within, from God, and from each other. But what I also found really, again, inspiring was just reading some books and some documentaries on the civil rights movement. And obviously, I wasn't born then, so I wasn't one that walked through that. Was the amount of love that was demonstrated by those who were attacked. That it was nonviolent and peaceful, yes, but because they were channeling the love of Christ and viewing, and I can't imagine this personally, but viewing those people who were spewing hatred and lies and abuse to them, they were viewing them as fellow humans, created in the image of God, beloved, and therefore they would not react negatively or try to give harm to others. And in this chapter, towards the end of the chapter, Thurman talks about this. And at first I thought, he's only addressing one side of the equation, but I think in reality, he is addressing everyone. And he's running, see if I can pull this up. It said, he's talking about the importance of seeing people eye to eye as fellow humans and having a genuine, sincere, authentic relationship. Listening, right? Like listening with intent. Tell me your story. I don't see you as anybody else other than I see myself. He writes, sincerity in human relations is equal to and the same as sincerity to God. If we accept this explanation as clue to Jesus' meaning, we come upon the stark fact that the insistence of Jesus upon genuineness is absolute. Man's relationship to man and man's relationship to God are one relation. Instead of relationship between the weak and the strong, there is merely a relationship between human beings. A man is a man, no more, no less. The awareness of this fact marks the supreme moment of human dignity. And that's powerful. And for me, Jesus came to restore that. He saw people. He said, love your enemies. And they go, well, how can we do that? If you're able to see them and not for the power that they have or in any other relationship other than sincere, genuine human as we are. And I believe, and Thurman would believe this too, we need that Spirit of Christ to empower us and embolden us to do that. Apart from Christ's example and ever-present help, it's really, really difficult to do that. But thanks be to God that we have that help, and we have Christ's example and presence that has fueled these movements of love and compassion, over these last 2,000 years.
Yeah, one of the things that really struck me as I read this book is how much moral authority he wants to put back in the hands of the disinherited. Because I think he believed that the conversation was going to move from the disinherited to the powerful. It was unlikely to go the other way around. And if you think about what happened in the United States from the time when he wrote this book in 1949, bring that up all the way through the 1960s, think about the number of Black men and women who were lynched during that period of time, right? So even to imagine having a conversation with a white person in power, again, I read the book and thought, he's really communicating to these individuals that, in a sense, you're the hope of the world, which goes all the way back to Jesus, essentially doing the same thing. You're the light, you're the light of the world. You're the salt of the earth. He's saying this also to disenfranchised people. And I thought it was such an incredibly empowering thing. I also have to believe that people, who would have been reading this book back in 1952 or 53 must have said, what? You're expecting us to do what? So anyway, I thought it was incredibly empowering to hear that trust that he had in those individuals to whom he's addressing, this book. And just one quick follow-up comment, in each one of these chapters, I was thinking today, if this was written as a self-help book, there would be like 8 steps at the end of each chapter, like things you can do not to be deceptive anymore, or things you can do to overcome your fear. None of that's here. When he talks about fear, when the antidote to fear is to remind yourself that you're a child of God. The antidote to deception is sincerity. And I think we want to say, well, break that down for me, give me the steps and the sub-steps, right? And the support group to go along with it and the follow-up book and journal, right? So I get the whole thing. No, not with Howard Thurman. It's almost as if he says, look, you know what sincerity means. You know what that is. Be sincere. Don't be anything other than sincere. Because I think, as you point out, Dan, he's saying sincerity will bring you close to God and it will bring you close to other people.
Thanks for listening to part 1 of our book club discussion of Jesus and the Disinherited. Want to be part of the conversation? Send us an email at podcast@roundhillcommunitychurch.org with any comments or questions, and be sure to join us next week for part 2.
Round Hill Radio is brought to you by the friends and members of Round Hill Community Church. For more information, please visit roundhillcommunitychurch.org.